Okay, it's 10 o'clock, so the subcommittee will come to order, and the chair will recognize himself for an opening statement. This is the Subcommittee on Energy, Climate, Grid Security, marking up 3 bills today. So I want to thank you all for being here. We're holding another markup to advance and unleash American energy. The bills we're taking up today will secure our nuclear supply chain, protect the freedom of Americans to choose their home appliances, and strengthen our grid against cyber threats. The United States has become increasingly dependent on Russian fuel necessary for our commercial nuclear fleet. Currently, Russian imports account for roughly 20% of the U.S. market. The war in Ukraine has made it abundantly clear that we cannot be at the whims of Russia for our fuel supply. It should be a bipartisan national security objective to wean the United States industry off of Russian uranium imports. This requires a made-in-America system for nuclear fuel, domestic sourcing. This includes mining, conversion, enrichment, and fabrication. The first step in this process is putting the marker down that we are banning Russian imports. I'm proud to co-sponsor H.R. 1042, the Prohibiting Russian Uranium Imports Act, introduced by Chair Rogers and my colleague, Mr. Latta from Ohio. This bill will prohibit the importation of unirradiated, that is, fresh, unused, low-enriched uranium produced in the Russian Federation. This will give the domestic industry the market certainty they need to invest and build out the necessary infrastructure. U.S. companies are already taking steps to this end, but without certainty about the role of Russian fuel in our market, investors won't put money in to expanded capacity. This bill would establish a date certain after which no Russian fuel will be available for the long term. That will allow this mature market to enter the long-term contracts needed to fund secure non-Russian supplies. The United States must lead in nuclear. This is important for energy reliability, national security, and emission reduction goals. I urge my colleagues on this committee to support this bill. The second bill that I want to talk about is another bipartisan national security priority. Should be hardening our critical energy infrastructure, protecting against cyber threats. H.R. 3277, the Energy Emergency Leadership Act, introduced by Representative Wahlberg and Blunt Rochester, would amend the Department of Energy Organization Act to elevate the leadership of DOE's emergency response and cybersecurity functions to the Senate-confirmed Assistant Secretary level. The DOE is the critical agency to coordinate, prepare for, and respond to all threats and hazards to our energy supply. Establishing Assistant Secretary leadership at the department will reflect the importance of managing this particular threat. This bill successfully moved through the House in the last Congress, and I'm optimistic it will have continued support in this Congress. And lastly, we will have taken up 1640, the Save Our Gas Stoves Act. I'm proud to co-sponsor this bill introduced by my colleague, Congressman Lesko. It is no secret this administration has waged war on American energy, doing everything in their power to phase out oil and gas. They are now taking it a step further, dictating what appliances Americans purchase for their homes-based fuel sources. Households that use natural gas for heating, cooking, clothes drying save an average of $1,068 per year compared to homes using electricity for those appliances. Low-income Americans will be the most harmed by the rush to green and mass electrification efforts pursued by the Biden administration. The Save Our Gas Stoves Act would prevent this by prohibiting the Secretary of Energy from finalizing, implementing, or enforcing the current proposed energy conservation standard for consumer conventional cooking products and prohibit the enactment of any substantially similar rule. Clarifying the Energy Policy and Conservation Act prohibits an implementation of an energy conservation standard that would result in a product being unavailable based upon the type of product the fuel consumes. Americans should be free to choose what cooking product they use in their homes, and this bill ensures that. Unfortunately, gas stove rulemaking is part of a larger effort against the consumer appliances to federally mandate that Americans purchase climate-friendlier appliances. So I commend Congresswoman Lesko's leadership on this issue. I urge my colleagues to support that legislation in front of us today, all of the legislation in front of us today, the 3 bills we're marking up, which prioritizes American energy security and puts the American people first. And I'll now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Gett, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to talk about the 3 bills that we're here to consider today, H.R. 1042, 1640, and 3277. The first one, H.R. 1042, prohibits the importation of Russian-made uranium into the U.S. Well, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a single person in this room who thinks that our continued reliance on Russian-made uranium is not a problem that must be addressed, including myself. So the legislation on its face seems like a common sense step to take, but think we need to talk about how we're going to make this happen, because the United States currently imports nearly 1/4 of its enriched uranium from Russia. And the bill says, and the chairman said, well, we shouldn't be importing from Russia. That is correct, we shouldn't. But we need a plan for how we're going to stop. Because even though, because the dependence on Russian-made uranium remains a constant threat to the fleet's future readiness, it puts our national security at risk, so we need to end our reliance. But it operates in a vacuum. We shouldn't be in a position where we're relying on a potential adversary for the resources we need. But first we need a plan to figure out where we're going to get that material from someplace else. We can't simply flip a switch and domestically produce the fuel needed overnight or even by 2028, as this bill would allow by granting waiver authority to the Secretary of Energy. And as it stands now, the United States can produce only 1/3 of the uranium the domestic fleet needs. So we have to expand the capability to fully satisfy our own needs. And I think it'll take significant time and a significant investment. And I would urge my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to work with us to do it. But before we cut ourselves off from this uranium supply, unfortunately, we need to work with our allies to ensure we have alternate sources of uranium. So if we figure that out, let's bring this bill back up again, and then I will be happy to vote for it. In addition, the legislation as it stands now still doesn't address the need for a strategy to deal with spent nuclear fuel. So whether it be in terms of Russian-made uranium or the overall expansion of nuclear power in the U.S., we have to address this issue of how to properly store spent fuel. I believe that nuclear is going to have to be a part of our overall plan to combat the climate crisis. But we have to not just talk about developing a long-term storage plan, we actually have to do it. And so I look forward to working together with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to do that. Now, let's talk for a minute about H.R. 1640. 1640 kills a congressionally mandated rulemaking that seeks to save Americans money on their energy costs. It furthers a misplaced fear that the government is somehow coming for your stoves. I am here to say the Department of Energy is not going to ban your gas stove. Let me say it again. The Department of Energy is not going to ban your gas stove. The energy efficiency rules that it's required by Congress to put in place cover both gas and electric stoves. They also apply only to new products and in no way will affect the stove you currently own. And in fact, nearly half of all gas stoves on the market today already comply with the rule being proposed and would still be fully available to consumers across the country. So let's tone down the rhetoric on this one. Instead of getting everybody ginned up on a non-issue, let's talk about the issues that need to be addressed. Well, okay, one more bill before us today, H.R. 3277. It elevates the head of the Office of Cybersecurity to an Assistant Secretary level position. That's a bill that was previously passed out of the committee by a voice vote last Congress. I expect that it will have no opposition today. Good news, we can at least pass one bill today by voice vote, and I yield back.
General yields back, and it's my honor to recognize the chair of the full committee, Chair Rogers, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This morning, the subcommittee continues our work to improve people's lives by making energy more affordable and strengthening American energy security. In order to achieve this, it is critical that the U.S. maintain a strong energy mix. That is how we win the future, with clean, reliable, and affordable energy to power our way of life, keep the lights on, build stronger communities, keep our economy going, and it's a key part of that energy mix is nuclear. American leadership in nuclear energy and nuclear technology is critical to our economic and national security, which is why One of the most urgent security needs America faces right now is our dangerous reliance on Russia's supply of nuclear fuels for our nuclear fleet. This threat is intensified as a result of the war in Ukraine. American nuclear fuel infrastructure has been stunted by policies that Russia has exploited by flooding the U.S. market with its cheaper fuel, which today accounts for more than 20% of nuclear fuels for American reactors. Last year alone, our industry paid over $850 million to Russia's state-owned nuclear corporation, Rosatom, and its fuel subsidiaries. How do you say that word? Thank you. That number could even be higher this year. And these resources are no doubt going towards funding Putin's war efforts in Ukraine. $850 million. Further, we've seen how Putin has weaponized Europe's reliance on Russian natural gas. There's no reason to believe that they wouldn't do the same with our nuclear fuel supply if they saw an opportunity. Rosatom has also supported China's nuclear energy ambitions. The risk of continuing this dependence on Russia for our nuclear fuels are simply too great. That's why I'm leading on H.R. 1042, the Prohibiting Russian Uranium Imports Act, along with Mr. Latta, which bans fuel imports from Russia and sends a strong signal to the market that will help restore American nuclear leadership and fuel infrastructure. We're also discussing several other important bills today, including H.R. 3277, the Energy Emergency Leadership Act, which Mr. Wahlberg and Ms. Blunt Rochester are leading to continue the committee's bipartisan focus on protecting our critical energy infrastructure. This bill, which passed the House last Congress, assures that DOE's important cybersecurity and emergency functions are led by a Senate-confirmed Assistant Secretary. We'll also be considering H.R. 1640, the Save Our Gas Stoves Act, which is led by Representative Lesko. This will prevent Department of Energy from banning gas stoves. This ban is just the latest attempt by the Biden administration to use the federal government's power to dictate every aspect of our lives, from what kind of a car we drive, how we wash our clothes, how we heat our homes and businesses, to now how Americans are allowed to cook food for our families by trying to ban gas stoves. Ultimately, these bans will only force higher costs on hardworking families and disproportionately harm the most vulnerable communities. I look forward to discussing these solutions in greater detail. I yield back.
Generally yields back, and I'll now go to the ranking member, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today we're marking up 3 energy bills. While I'm pleased that we're moving forward with a bipartisan bill that passed the House last Congress, I'm concerned the Republican majority continues to pave a partisan path when it comes to energy policy to the detriment of the American people. H.R. 3277, the Energy Emergency Leadership Act, is a bipartisan bill that directs the Secretary of Energy to designate energy emergency and security matters to an assistant secretary. This bill will ensure the continued prioritization of addressing our energy infrastructure and cybersecurity threats, and I thank Representatives Blunt, Rochester, and Wahlberg for their leadership on this legislation, this Congress. Unfortunately, the good ideas end there. H.R. 1630, the so-called Save Our Gas Stoves Act, is nothing more than a political stunt to continue the Republican scare tactics and outright misinformation when it comes to energy efficiency standards. H.R. 1630 prevents the Department of Energy from finalizing a common-sense, congressionally mandated energy efficiency standard for new cooktops. The proposed rule simply requires new cooktops to be more efficient. This will reduce energy bills for consumers and cut harmful indoor air pollution that disproportionately impacts children's health. We're likely to hear a lot of scare tactics about this rule today. And despite what you'll hear from my Republican colleagues, it does not ban gas stoves, it does not remove gas stoves from homes, and it does not prevent you from putting a gas stove in your home. In fact, 50% of the stoves on the market today are already in compliance with the proposed standard, which will not take effect until 3 years after it's finalized. Republicans claim to care about energy prices, but this bill prohibits DOE from finalizing a rule that could save consumers up to $1.7 billion a year. DOE is only trying to make stoves more efficient and lower energy bills for Americans, but Republicans are moving a bill today that will increase energy prices for consumers. Rather than focusing on the facts, Republicans are misleading Americans in order to keep their fossil fuel friends happy, and I urge my colleagues to oppose this political stunt. We'll also consider H.R. 1042, the Prohibiting Russian Uranium Imports Act. America's nuclear power reactors are far too reliant on Russian-enriched uranium for fuel. Today, about 20% of the uranium used to power these reactors is imported from Russia. This was a problem before Putin's invasion of Ukraine, but this tragic war has only underscored how problematic it is that America is so reliant on Russia for nuclear fuel. The United States needs to develop a more robust domestic nuclear fuel cycle industry. The problem here is not mining the uranium. The real choke point is uranium conversion and enrichment, two critical steps necessary before mined uranium can be placed into a reactor. Our nation only has one enrichment facility and not a single currently operating conversion facility. Because of this, no matter how much uranium is mined domestically, we still rely on other countries to process it. So I support ending our dangerous reliance on Russia for enriched uranium, but simply banning the importation of Russian uranium will not solve this problem. We need more domestic conversion and enrichment capability, or else we could face a problematic situation in which our nation's nuclear power reactors might struggle to find the fuel they need to operate. Secretary Granholm voiced support for a more comprehensive solution to build this infrastructure domestically when she testified before the subcommittee last Thursday. When asked about a ban on Russian uranium, Secretary Granholm said, and I quote, "I'm worried about the gap. We need to build up the supply here." So I plan to oppose H.R. 1042. I find our continued reliance on Russian uranium very troubling, and my staff requested that any Russian uranium ban also include investments in domestic fuel cycle infrastructure, but we were told that was not on the table at this time. We should pass a ban without addressing, we should not, in my opinion, we should not pass a ban without addressing the underlying lack of domestic nuclear fuel cycle infrastructure, and I will actually have an amendment when the bill comes up to do that, and I hope we can find a way to work together to achieve both of these important goals together. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman, the balance.
Gentleman yields back, and the chair will remind members that pursuant to the committee rules, all members' opening statements will be made part of the record. Are there any further opening statements? Mr. Latta is recognized for an opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for holding today's markup. I wanted to speak briefly in favor of the General Lady of the Full Committee Chair's legislation, the Prohibiting Russian Uranium Imports Act, of which I am an original co-sponsor. For several Congresses now, I have advocated for policies that would help our domestic nuclear industry build up their supply chains and reduce U.S. reliance on foreign nations for nuclear fuels. This is a matter of energy security and national security. I've previously led a legislative effort to authorize the establishment of a uranium reserve, and more recently introduced legislation to establish and expand our domestic nuclear fuel programs. In the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it is critical that the United States immediately stops subsidizing Putin's war through the continued importation of Russian fuels. I applaud the chairwoman for her leadership in crafting this legislation and look forward to discussing it today. I'm happy that my legislation and this effort to ban Russian uranium imports have both spurred a conversation surrounding the need to boost the domestic fuels market, and I believe we can and will advance this effort in a bipartisan way. After having discussions with industry and other stakeholders, I believe the chairwoman's legislation takes the right approach in sending a critical market signal that Russian uranium imports will be cut off and industry will need to focus on new fueling sources. At the same time, I believe we will have to do more work to help grow our domestic supply of HALEU. I want to work with our full committee chair, the subcommittee chairman, and with the colleagues from across the aisle to update my legislation to reflect new feedback before it is considered by our subcommittee. Later, I'll be offering an amendment to H.R. 1042 that will, in addition to making technical changes, require the execution of a market evaluation to ensure DOE and Congress will have the most up-to-date information as we explore avenues to support industry. This will inform the necessary blueprint for boosting the domestic nuclear fuels industry and will put us on a path to greater energy security. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any further opening statements? Seeing nobody seeking recognition, the chair will call up H.R. 3277. Before I recognize the clerk to read the bill, I just want to thank all of our staff on both sides that sit through the markup, sit through the hearings, and do the incredible work. Noah was an intern in my office 3-4 years ago, and it's great to see you at the table. So the clerk will report the title.
H.R. 3277, a bill to amend the Department of Energy Organization Act with respect to functions assigned to assistant secretaries and for other purposes. Be it enacted by the Senate and the House of Representatives of the United States of America and Congress assembled. Section 1, short title. This act may be cited as the Energy Emergency Leadership Act.
Without objection, first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point, so ordered. Are there any bipartisan amendments to H.R. 3277? Okay, seeing that no amendments will be offered, any discussion on the bill? The chair will recognize Mr. Wahlberg.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, we're considering H.R. 3277, the Energy Emergency Leadership Act, which I introduced along with my friend, Congressman Blunt Rochester. The legislation requires a Secretary of Energy to elevate energy emergency and energy security functions to the Assistant Secretary level. Addressing threats to our energy reliability is of the highest importance, and we need to structure the department accordingly. As we become more reliant on technology in every aspect of our lives, it's important to understand the magnitude of the risks associated with this dependence. Our nation's critical energy infrastructure, in particular, is a prime target for cyber attacks, and the consequences of a successful attack could be catastrophic. In addition, as our energy systems become increasingly more complex, they have also become more vulnerable to all manner of hazards, including natural disasters, physical attacks, and global shortages. We need to be better prepared. We all saw the shortages and chaos that ensued after Colonial Pipeline suffered a ransomware attack. Imagine what would happen if a cyber attack were to shut down our electric grid for even a day. Hospitals would be unable to provide critical care, transportation systems would be disrupted, and our economy would grind to a halt. The potential loss of life and damage to our economy is simply too great to ignore. The FAST Act rightfully provides the DOE with several new energy security authorities to respond to physical and cyber attacks to our critical energy infrastructure. DOE built on this authority by creating the Office of Cybersecurity and Energy Security Emergency Response, or CSER. Congress should strengthen this mission further by creating a Senate-confirmed Assistant Secretary position to run CSER. We would need a dedicated person to turn to with respect to infrastructure, cybersecurity, emergency planning, and emerging threats. This bill will help to ensure that our government has the necessary leadership and coordination to respond quickly and effectively to any crisis, including cyber attacks on our critical infrastructure. It will also promote continuity of high-level leadership throughout future administrations, increase accountability, and encourage more effective and seamless information sharing with federal and industry stakeholders. The threats we face are serious. We need to provide DOE with all the tools we can to address them and secure our energy future. I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 3277, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Any other members seeking recognition? Ms. Blunt Rochester recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the recognition. The growth in connected devices and distributed energy resources promises cost-saving benefits to Americans through improvements in energy efficiency. However, the growth in devices and infrastructure with increased connectivity and automation throughout the electricity system also makes the energy systems on which our constituents and our businesses rely vulnerable to cyber attacks and natural disasters. In 2022, the number of risks to critical infrastructure escalated due to the increase in cyber ransom crimes, threats from nation-state actors, and the war in Ukraine. Members of this committee will remember the cyber attacks on the Colonial Pipeline. We have also seen energy grids shut down by individuals destroying transformers at power stations. Protecting the web of power resources that ensure the health and wellness of our country and economy is critical, and our government needs the resources to protect these energy systems from potential threats that will arise. I am proud to co-lead H.R. 3277, the Energy Emergency Leadership Act, with Mr. Wahlberg, who I have partnered with on multiple different bills, and appreciate your leadership, because it will help us tackle the myriad of threats facing our critical infrastructure. Our bill will support the Department of Energy in its efforts to coordinate, prepare, and respond to all hazards to the supply of energy, including cybersecurity and natural disasters. This Assistant Secretary level position will strengthen coordination across the department, ensure more effective interagency collaborations, and increase accountability to Congress. This legislation will go a long way in helping to protect the nation's electric infrastructure from threats that could cause disruptions to our lives, our economy, and undermine our national security. It is imperative that we take proactive steps to mitigate the risks of these types of attacks, and the Energy Emergency Leadership Act will help in achieving that goal. I encourage my colleagues to support this bipartisan legislation, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back. Any other members seeking recognition on the bill? Chair will recognize himself, and I move to strike last word and am recognized. I want to thank the bipartisanship on this particular piece of legislation. I think it's critical as we talk about building out the infrastructure that's needed, not just repairing and updating, but building out future infrastructure, making sure we have someone at the Department of Energy that is dedicated and focused to making sure the components are put in place as we build it out, making sure that we address all the national security threats that could happen on our infrastructure. The gentlelady mentioned Colonial Pipeline. One of many instances where we believe that cyber hacks have tried to take place, and we know there are foreign bad actors out there that are attempting it every minute, every day. So this is critical. I appreciate the bill. I support it. And with that, I'll yield back. Any other members seeking recognition? Seeing none, the question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 3277 to the full committee. All those in favor say aye. Any opposed, no? And the ayes have it. I'm sorry. Y'all want a roll call? Okay. Okay, a roll call has been requested, so the clerk is instructed to call the roll.
Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes aye. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes aye. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg. Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Palmer. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Curtis votes aye. Ms. Lesko. Ms. Lesko votes aye. Mr. Pence. Mr. Pence votes aye. Mr. Armstrong. Mr. Weber. Mr. Weber votes aye. Mr. Balderson. Mr. Balderson votes aye. Mr. Pfluger. Mr. Pfluger votes aye. Chair Rogers. Chair Rogers votes aye. Mr. Duncan. Chair Duncan votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes aye. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters votes aye. Ms. Fletcher.
Aye.
Ms. Fletcher votes aye. Ms. Matsui.
Aye.
Ms. Matsui votes aye. Mr. Tonko.
Aye.
Mr. Tonko votes aye. Mr. Veazey. Mr. Veazey votes aye. Ms. Custer. Ms. Custer votes aye. Ms. Schreier. Ms. Schreier votes aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Mr. Cardenas. Mr. Cardenas votes aye. Ms. Blunt Rochester. Ms. Blunt Rochester votes aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye.
Is any member not recorded? Mr. Palmer, how's Mr. Palmer recorded?
Mr. Palmer is not recorded. Mr. Palmer votes aye. Mr. Armstrong is not recorded. Mr. Armstrong votes aye.
Any other member not recorded? With that, the clerk will call the tally.
Chair Duncan, on that vote, there were 30 ayes and 0 noes.
The ayes have it. The bill is agreed to and be forwarded to the full committee. The chair will now call up H.R. 1640 and ask clerk to report.
H.R. 1640, a bill to prohibit the Secretary of Energy from finalizing, implementing, or enforcing the proposed rule titled Energy Conservation Program, Energy Conservation Standards.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point. So ordered. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Okay. Any amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the chair will now recognize the sponsor of the bill, Ms. Lesko, to explain the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm proud to sponsor H.R. 1640, the Save Our Gas Stoves Act. This bill prohibits the Department of Energy from implementing its proposed rule that would eliminate the future sale of the vast majority of gas stove products that are available today. The DOE's proposed rule for consumer conventional cooking products applies the maximum technologically feasible level, something that has never been done before. There are basically 2 types of gas stoves: the cooktops that don't include an oven and are mounted on top of the counter, and the more common freestanding ranges that combine the cooktop with the oven. The proposed rule, based on DOE's own analysis, would eliminate 96% of gas cooktops that are available today. And let me show you that so that you say that it's not disinformation. It's right in the DOE's own report right here, which I can submit for the record. The proposed, even worse, the rule would eliminate all currently available models of freestanding ranges, which make up almost 90% of all gas stoves sold today. Let me repeat, no freestanding ranges that have been tested meet the standards level under the proposed new rule. So, when Secretary Granholm told us just last week that the new rule would only affect high-end gas stove products, that is simply not the case. Testing by the Association of Home Appliance Manufacturers found that under the proposed rule, the time it would take to boil a pot of water would increase by about 7 minutes. Over a full year, the new standard would cost consumers nearly a full day simply waiting for water to boil. The new standard could mean ranges and cooktops would have no more than 1 large burner, which of course would be hard for large families. In DOE's own report, again, right here, it says that the proposed rule would eliminate 96% of an entire class of cooktops available today. Then later, DOE claimed that only 50% of the products available today would be eliminated. And that has been brought up by my Democratic colleagues about the 50%. But it appears DOE pulled this number out of thin air because DOE didn't even test the stoves that they said would qualify, so how do they know that they would? To date, DOE provides no data or substantiation for how it determined the models on retailer websites which would meet its proposed standards. DOE estimates that the proposed rule will save $21.89 per stove over 14 years. That's $1.50 a year or 12 cents a month. Hardly worth the lack of consumer choice, hardly worth the lack of having large burners, hardly worth waiting for water to boil for 7 additional minutes per pot of water. According to the DOE, natural gas is 3.5 times cheaper than electricity. According to studies, households that use natural gas for heating, cooking, and clothes drying save an average of $1,068 per year compared to homes using electricity for those applications. This bill already has 55 bipartisan co-sponsors. Republicans and 29 Democrats already voted for an amendment on the floor, which was included in H.R. 1 to do the same thing as this bill. I ask my colleagues to join me in protecting consumer choice. I ask my colleagues to join me in saving our gas stoves. I ask my colleagues to join me in voting yes. And Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a letter from the American Gas Association supporting my bill, and I yield back.
Without objection, so ordered. Any other discussion on the bill? Mr. Tonko is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move to strike the last word. I want to be perfectly clear. DOE is not proposed banning gas stoves, and that's worth repeating. The proposed rule that would be blocked by this legislation simply would not ban gas stoves. This rule would also not apply to existing appliances. It would go into effect on new stoves several years from now. DOE's proposal is not some unachievable goal. 50% of the gas stoves currently on the market, including entry-level models, can already achieve the proposed standard. There's no doubt that there will be plenty of available options when this rule goes into effect. Let's remember that DOE's efficiency standards protects consumers. They ensure that manufacturers, especially foreign manufacturers that are happy to dump cheap, low-quality products on American consumers, must achieve minimum levels of energy efficiency. As someone who represents many people with gas stoves, I want to make certain they have access to the most efficient appliances. Over the past year, I heard from many constituents dealing with soaring fuel prices. People with more efficient appliances are better able to cope with these price shocks. This is why DOE has estimated that its proposal will result in some $1.7 billion worth of savings for consumers. This is especially important for renters, who very often do not have a choice on what appliances their landlord will provide for them. I remember when there was bipartisan agreement around the importance of energy efficiency. It is a common-sense, low-cost, consumer-friendly strategy to reduce demand for all fuel types. We should be striving to get back to that consensus by making energy efficiency our fuel of choice. This bill is the wrong approach. It will allow wasteful products to continue to be sold when there is widespread availability of superior, cost-effective, and more efficient stoves. With that, I urge members to oppose this bill. And Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Any other members seeking recognition? Gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word in support of this legislation. Over the last few years, we've seen this push to get rid of natural gas, and as a result, the federal government's effort to micromanage people's lives has significantly picked up steam. As I said in the Environment Subcommittee last week, this points to a troubling pattern at the EPA, the Department of Energy, and the entire administration, for that matter. What they do is pick a policy outcome, whether it's ending the use of natural gas or oil, pushing Americans toward electric vehicles or other green wish list items, and then shoehorn in a regulation on the back end to make it happen. What's the reasoning for this? Well, they say to protect the environment and reduce carbon emissions, of course. It's good for your own good, they say. But are we sure about that? Because it's important to realize that this proposed gas stove ban is not occurring in a vacuum. The American people are struggling with inflation, and in real time, they are seeing their standard of living decline relative to their income. In Appalachia, Ohio, do you think my constituents have the money to rewire their home's entire electric system for an electric range and pay to get their gas line capped and the meter taken off? Now, I'm sure that wasn't in the sales pitch for the all-electric kitchen. And this isn't a one-off. Here's a little more context on what the American people are facing. The forced electrification is coming for much more than just our stoves. For example, many of my constituents heat their homes affordably and reliably with natural gas, but not if the Biden administration has its way. DOE just last year proposed rules to outlaw many popular gas furnaces to force Americans into installing expensive electric heat pumps. That could run up astronomical electric bills in cold climates. And water heaters? Well, the Department of Energy is coming for those too. They've proposed policies to mandate so-called, quote, demand response technology, better described as remote control capability, so the government can shut water heaters off in the case of a strained electric grid. Demand response is also being proposed for thermostats and even washers and refrigerators. Are you seeing a pattern here, friends? Instead of using its resources and expertise to work to provide more abundant and reliable baseload electricity, our Department of Energy has decided that the American people are the problem, that our citizens use too much energy. And they believe it's the American people who must sacrifice, and it doesn't end there. This summer, in fact, my constituents, again, already suffering with inflation, will be in for a rude awakening when they stop at the hardware store on the way home from work and they find out about the new light bulbs rule. I kid you not, the Department of Energy just last month announced it'll institute new rules to outlaw the sale of incandescent light bulbs and mandate more expensive LED bulbs starting in August. And finally, I mentioned water heaters. When hardworking Americans get home from work and running their errands and feed their kids, I'm glad they can rest assured that DOE is still thinking of them when they can take a shower under a recently reinstated DOE-mandated maximum flow rate compliant shower head. So I think everyone gets the picture. These are all reasons why the LESCO legislation is sorely needed. These types of rules to electrify homes in natural gas and limit energy use don't cut nearly enough carbon to influence the global climate. China and India alone are increasing emissions astronomically farther above the reductions we'll see from any of these rules. But why does the administration still press forward? It's not about air conditioners or dishwashers, which have new rules too. It's actually much simpler because it's not about carbon. Because if it were, we'd see cooperation from the administration in expanding the use of American natural gas, both here at home and abroad. No, it's not about carbon, it's about control. But instead of empowering Americans and making it a goal to improve the quality of living standards, bureaucrats in the Biden administration will stop at nothing to use the levers of government to pick winners and losers and centrally plan the economy. This legislation would curb many of these worst abuses, and I urge my colleagues to support it. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. He yields back. Any other member seeking recognition? Ms. Castro from Florida is recognized for 5 minutes.
Move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Well, thank you so much. Colleagues, Americans are free to choose their home appliances. My neighbors back home are very good at comparison shopping. They are always, when we're talking about the kitchen, they're looking for an appliance that's safe. They're looking for an appliance that's affordable. They're looking for something that serves their needs. You know, we've come a long way from cooking over open flame and hand washing our clothes in the last century. Thank goodness appliances in America have gotten better and better over time. But let's talk about the fantastic energy-efficient induction cooktops. They are similar to the glass electric cooktops that many people are familiar with, but they outperform and now innovate anything else that's on the market now. And I thought I would borrow from David Letterman's top 10, but I'll spare you 10. I'll just give you 5. These induction cooktops are very easy to clean. Nothing gets stuck in the gas wires and down there. They're smooth, they're easy to clean. Number 4, reason that you're gonna love induction cooktops. According to Consumer Reports, induction cooktops outperform every other kind of range. They heat up quickly, You don't have to sit there watching your pot of water boiling. It happens really fast. Superb simmering. It better responds to your desired heat control. Top 3 reason. There are built-in safety features. If you do not have your pot on the stove, it doesn't turn on. The cooktop doesn't heat up. You're not going to get burned. Your kids aren't going to get burned. This is a fantastic, let me talk to you as a mom. This is a wonderful safety feature. Number 2, top 10 reason. They are more efficient than gas or electric. And there are incredible discounts now. Thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act, a family can save about $840 on these energy-efficient appliances, depending upon your income. So please don't peddle this misinformation that these are expensive. This is a consumer choice, and right now you get a significant rebate money back into your pocket. But the number 1 reason you all are gonna love induction cooktops, they're better for the environment, they're better for your health. These do not burn fossil fuels in your home. It is a real problem, especially because most people do not have ventilation. They don't even turn on their range hoods when they're cooking with methane gas. Methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. Recent studies have shown that methane leaking from gas-burning stoves installed in U.S. homes, even when they're turned off, have the same negative impact on the environment as carbon dioxide emitted from around 500 gasoline-powered vehicles. This is also a significant health concern. If you have children who suffer from asthma, if you're if you're a pregnant woman, what's happening in your kitchen, carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, other pollutants and carcinogens are going right into your kitchen. These can trigger asthma attacks, significant heart impacts. What's really happening here is my colleagues are trying to scare you, say, we're coming for your stove. That's not what this is about. What this is about is saving you money, cutting pollution, and tackling the climate crisis. But my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are so wedded to polluter profits, the gas and oil industry, that they're willing to go this far with this conspiracy-laden bill. It's a waste of our time. It's a disservice to our neighbors back home who are smarter than this. They can make their own decisions if you give them the information they need. So I gave you five top reasons why the induction stove is the way of the future. They're easier to clean. They outperform anything else on the market. They have built-in safety features. They're more efficient, and there are incredible discounts right now. Go to rewiringamerica.org, put in your zip code. You can find out how much money you can save. It's $840 for these appliances, depending on your income, but most importantly, they're better for your health. They're better for the environment. They're going to help us save money, cut pollution, and mitigate the climate crisis. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Generally yields back. I'll now go to Mr. Palmer for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
I appreciate the fact that we've been making the point that the Biden administration, the Department of Energy, has been threatening access to gas stoves. Not only that, to other residential and commercial uses of natural gas. And I appreciate the fact that my Democratic colleagues are now admitting that they're full-fledged in support of this with their comments. Saying that the Department of Energy and that our Democratic colleagues have no desire to eliminate natural gas reminds me of the epilogue about boiling a frog. You know, you start by putting the frog in lukewarm water and you gradually turn up the heat until it's too late. And only, as Representative Lesko pointed out, using an electric stove, it will just take a lot longer to boil that frog. According to the Department of Energy's own analysis, 38% of Americans use natural gas for cooking. And I remember as a kid, as I've pointed out a few times, I grew up dirt poor. We heated our house with a coal-burning stove. And I was in 7th grade before we were finally able to get a natural gas floor furnace that my dad installed himself, and what natural gas meant to our household and what it means to other Americans who depend on natural gas to heat their homes, to heat their water, to cook their food. But the American people see this for what it is. It's really a direct attack on all natural gas use in the country. And it's another example of the Biden administration's desire to control every decision that we make. And it's essentially a tax on consumers who are already being squeezed by inflation. As I pointed out many times in here, energy costs are the single most inflationary component in the entire economy. And this idea that we're going to use government subsidies, those are not cost-free. We all know this, that it comes out of the taxpayers' pockets. Everybody's paying for it. The regulatory cost, everybody pays for that. That gets passed on to the consumer. And what they're doing here, again, is just inflicting another financial burden, particularly on low-income and middle-income families. They argue that I heard one of my Democratic colleagues make the point that half of the stoves already meet the proposed rule. Well, we don't even know what the proposed rule is yet, but I'm happy to point out that also means that half of them don't. And we don't know whose households that 50% are in. So I just think the legislation that Representative Lesko has brought to the table is not only the right course of action to oppose what the Department of Energy is doing, what my Democrat colleagues are trying to do, what the Biden administration is trying to do, just another example of a complete disregard for economics, for how people live, for how people want to live. I really think she's providing a great service to the American people by introducing this legislation. And I'd also like to point out that it makes us less reliant on China. I mean, this idea that we're going to go 100% renewable just means we'll be 100% reliant on China. And there's so many things that you could say about where this administration is heading with its energy policy that I think the American people are beginning to wake up to, not only how it undermines our economic security, but it's undermining our national security. And it may sound strange to link that to preserving the right to have a natural gas cooktop, but it all fits together with this huge agenda that the Biden administration, my Democrat colleagues, are trying to enforce upon the American people that impact their choices, but also impact the long-term economic viability of this nation. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I enthusiastically encourage every member of this committee to vote for Representative Lesko's bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Any other member seeking recognition? Gentlelady, Ms. Fletcher from Texas, recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I just want to weigh in very briefly here to say that I agree that the federal government should not be banning gas stoves. Like many Texans, my gas stove got me through the freeze a couple of years ago when we were out of power for several days. Between having a gas stove and a gas jet fireplace, that was about all we could do when the temperature was less than 40 degrees inside our own home, and then we had to boil our water on top of that. So certainly, many of us in Texas understand the importance. I just want to make a quick point. There are a handful of concerns about some differences in this bill and the amendment we voted for on the floor, very technical around some of the language here. And so I intend to vote yes on this bill today, but I would love it if we could get an agreement that we could work through some of these technical concerns, because I do think that energy efficiency standards are an important tool at DOE for driving innovation, for dealing with efficiency, and there's a little bit of concern around the future rulemaking piece in Section 3. So if we could just agree to work on that, I'd appreciate it.
Gentlelady yields back, and we'll definitely have staffs talk about any suggestions you may have before this gets to full committee markup.
Terrific. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Any other member? Mr. Pence, Indiana.
Chairman, thank you. I'd like to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Yield my time to the gentlelady from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Pence. I just want to address a couple of the things that have been said. My Democratic colleague, Representative Castor, talked passionately about induction cooktop stoves, said my legislation was a waste of time. I obviously disagree. But the thing I want to really concentrate on what she said is something to the effect of constituents are smart. They can make their own decisions about what stoves to buy. Well, that's exactly the point of my legislation. The Department of Energy's new proposed energy efficiency standards will not allow people to select whatever stove they want to have, because even in the DOE's own report, it said that it would, 96% of existing cooktops, gas cooktops, would not meet the new standards. And all of the freestanding stoves that 90% of the people have in their homes, which is the cooktop on the top and the oven, freestanding, none of those would qualify for the new standards. So the stoves would have to be changed. That's all that would be available on the market. So people won't have a choice. That's my point. That's the point of the legislation. The other thing that I'd like to point out is several of my Democratic colleagues even said in their argument against my bill, well, the DOE says that it would only affect 50% of the existing gas stoves. Well, that means 50% of the gas stoves won't be available. The ones that are available today will not be available in the future to purchase. And the last thing I'd like to say is there's, some of my Democratic colleagues are like, it will not ban existing gas stoves. They're not going to take them out of the home. I agree. That's not what it does. That's not what my bill does. What it says is that the DOE cannot impose these standards so that new stoves that are on the market will not be available to constituents. And with that, I yield back.
Yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back his time. Any other member seeking recognition? Mr. Pfluger from Texas recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. But I'll be brief. I have to ask the question of why are we here? What's the purpose of this? And I think we can sum it up by saying it's overreach. And the reason that we're having to have this markup is because we've seen incredible examples of overreach. I mean, Americans at home, if you're wondering why congressional approval ratings may be sub 10%, it's because we're having to have a hearing in a markup like this to push back on the overreach. We had the Secretary of Energy here last week, and there were a couple of questions that I in particular asked and others asked. And I have to point out that, let's look at the priorities of the Department of Energy. When I asked the Secretary of Energy where our energy came from, how much annual electricity Americans use, the Secretary unfortunately did not know those answers that were clearly on the website that DOE publishes. And if you're thinking about national security issues right now, China, the CCP, our adversaries around the world have to be laughing at the fact that we're literally having to have a talk about consumer selection of appliances. Instead of focusing on where our energy is going to come from and allowing our country to produce the best sources of energy, we're literally having to push back on the overreach the Biden administration has consistently shown Americans that they're willing to do. And it comes in the form of now stoves and natural gas stoves in homes. So, it's for my constituents back home, I want you to know that every single day I'm going to be up here really focusing on the national security issues, which involve making sure that we can produce enough energy and we don't have to be reliant on other countries for our energy. And today is an example of supporting my colleague, Ms. Lesko, because she's doing a great job of pushing back on the overreach that this administration has consistently demonstrated that they're willing to do in the form of telling you what kind of stove you can have in your home. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you for this. I wish that we were not in this position to have this markup, but we are, and I appreciate the efforts to push back. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Any other member seeking recognition? Seeing no other, I'll recognize myself. I move to strike the last word and recognize myself. This rule may not be out there yet, but it is a proposed rule by the Department of Energy. We have a legislative responsibility in the role of governing this nation to make decisions about what's in the best interest of our nation, our states, and ultimately our constituents. This is the wrong approach from the Department of Energy, which at a time when we have so many other needs to address, like advanced nuclear technology to maybe lessen our dependence on some fossil fuel generation, we're focusing on household appliances. I want to just put this fact out there. Nearly 187 million Americans use natural gas because it's more affordable and reliable. That's not to leave out the future homeowners who are building a house and designing their appliances and want to have choices to make for the best interest of them and their family, the most affordable, the most reliable, and most efficient to cook the meals that they provide for their families. And I'm not going to leave out the thousands upon thousands of restaurants across this country that prepare our meals every day on gas stoves, gas cooktops. And as a small business owner in the past, I can tell you these restaurants make business decisions from a cost-effectiveness standpoint, a long-term utility bill standpoint, and the bottom line. And they choose natural gas. They choose gas cooktops to use when the choices are currently out there to go electric for their restaurant or gas, and they choose gas because it's the best interest for their bottom line. It's the best interest for efficiency within their restaurant to provide those meals in a timely manner for the customers that are sitting out there waiting. So maybe the rule isn't out there yet, but we see blue states across this country already banning stoves in their home. Stoves today, hot water heaters tomorrow, HVA systems and heat packs the next day, and it goes on and on. I think the time is now to say no. To say no, that it's not the role of the federal government to limit the choices of American families that they make for their homes, their food preparation, and their bottom line, and their utility cost. So I appreciate the gentlelady for authoring this bill. I'm a proud co-sponsor of it. I urge my colleagues to support it because I think it's the right legislative move for the elected representatives in the United States Congress who have a role in governing this nation. It's not just the Department of Energy's responsibility for doing this. We have a responsibility to focus on what might be coming down the pike and whether that will be good or bad for the nation. This is forward thinking to stop limiting the consumer choices our constituents can make or not make. And with that, I yield back. Any other member seeking recognition? Seeing none, the chair will ask the clerk to call the roll. We do have a recorded vote requested, so we're just going to move straight to that.
Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes aye. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes aye. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg. Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Palmer. Mr. Palmer votes aye. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Curtis votes aye. Ms. Lesko. Ms. Lesko votes aye. Mr. Pence. Mr. Pence votes aye. Mr. Armstrong. Mr. Weber. Mr. Weber votes aye. Mr. Balderson. Mr. Balderson votes aye. Mr. Fluger. Mr. Fluger votes aye. Chair Rogers. Chair Rogers votes aye. Chair Duncan. Chair Duncan votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters votes no. Ms. Fletcher. Aye. Ms. Fletcher votes aye. Ms. Matsui.
No.
Ms. Matsui votes no. Mr. Tonko.
No.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Mr. Veazey. Mr. Veazey votes aye. Ms. Custer. Ms. Custer votes no. Ms. Schreier. Ms. Schreier votes aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Mr. Cardenas. Mr. Cardenas votes no. Ms. Blunt Rochester. Ms. Blunt Rochester votes no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no.
Is any member not recorded?
Mr. Guthrie, you are not recorded. Mr. Guthrie votes aye.
How's Mr. Armstrong reported?
Mr. Armstrong is not recorded. Mr. Armstrong votes aye.
Any other member unrecorded? Seeing no one, none, the clerk will report the total.
Chair Duncan, on that vote, there were 20 ayes and 10 noes.
The ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to and be forwarded to the full committee. The chair will now call up H.R. 1042 and ask clerk to report.
H.R. 1042, a bill to prohibit the importation into the United States of unirradiated, low-enriched uranium that is produced in the Russian Federation and for other purposes. Be it enacted by the Senate and the House of Representatives of the United
Without
States.
objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any time. So ordered. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Any other amendments to the bill?
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Latta is recognized. You have an amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk labeled MA_01 to HR 1042.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1042, offered by Mr. Latta. Page 4, line 2, after Representatives, insert the Committee on Finance.
For the reading of the amendments dispensed with, Mr. Latta is recognized to explain the amendment.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment to HR 1042 accomplishes 2 points. First, respond to some technical assistance from the Department of Energy to remove one of the consultations with the Department of Commerce because the programs at issue are DOE programs. Members should know that this bill, which we started working on last year, reflects technical advice from DOE, its National Nuclear Security Administration, and the Department of Commerce. This portion of the amendment also provides conforming changes to the underlying law. Second, the amendment revises Section 3 of H.R. 1042 to replace a funding authorization for the American Assured Fuel Supply with a more comprehensive market evaluation for DOE to begin immediately upon enactment. Here, rather than focus on an existing DOE program that would risk undermining market competition for new capacity, DOE would first identify potential domestic supply needs, taking into account waivers authorized under the bill, private and government enriched uranium inventories, market demand and current orders, and announced plans for new production capacity, including domestic capacity. This evaluation will provide DOE, this committee, and appropriators up-to-date information to authorize and provide targeted support needed for the industry if it's needed. And this would account for market competition, supply diversity, and long-term fuel supply needs for the United States. I agree with our chairwoman that the prerequisite for any action to ensure that we have domestic supplies is to provide the certainty that Russian fuel will not be available to the United States for a long period of time. The markets for fuel is a mature market. The United States has the largest nuclear fuel market in the world. Recent Commerce Department determinations find that Russia has limited options if we cut them off and strong incentive to flood the market if it has the opportunity. Right now, we could lose Russian access to Russian fuels at any time. Last week, the Secretary of Energy said that utilities need to build up domestic capacity in advance before they can end the use of Russian supplies. I agree with our chairwoman that this thinking only delays the action we must take to provide market certainty. Without assurance that Russia will not re-enter the market in the future, there will not be the certainty needed to invest in new capacity, and taxpayers shouldn't carry this risk either. If we don't provide that market certainty, our nuclear fleet will remain at risk of supply disruptions, and Russia will continue to benefit from its strategic control over U.S. energy supplies. I urge my colleagues to adopt this amendment and support H.R. 1042. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Any other member wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, we'll now call for a vote. All those in favor of the Latta amendment, say aye. Aye. Any opposed, no. And the ayes have it. Any other member wishing to offer an amendment?
Mr. Chairman?
Ms. Custer.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word. I'm going to offer and withdraw my amendment Custer 029.
Young lady is recognized. So we've withdrawn that amendment?
No, I was going to speak to it. I didn't know.
You're recognized.
Thank you.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Thank you.
Amendment to H.R. 1042, offered by Ms. Custer of New Hampshire. Page 2, line 7, insert, or by a Russian entity.
Reading the amendment is dispensed with, and Ms. Custer is recognized to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think everyone in this committee can agree that the United States should not buy low-enriched uranium from Russia. The proceeds of the more than $1 billion that we spend on these imports go directly into the Russian war machine and the unlawful Russian war in Ukraine. My amendment would widen the definition in this bill to make it more difficult for Rosatom, Russia's state-owned nuclear energy company, and its affiliates to cannot evade the import prohibition in the bill. As this bill moves to full committee, I hope we can work in a bipartisan way to strengthen the underlying proposal to ensure Russia cannot evade these restrictions. I also hope we can ensure there is adequate support for the domestic supply chains to ensure there are no fuel disruptions due to this ban. And with that, I ask for unanimous consent to withdraw my amendment.
Gentleman yields back. Anyone else seeking recognition speak on the amendment? She withdrew the amendment. Great.
Oh, yeah.
So gentleman withdrew the amendment. Any other amendments to be offered? Ms. Rogers recognized.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman moves to strike the last word. Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we sit here today, our nuclear industry continues to purchase more than 20% of its nuclear fuel from Russia. Russia ranks as the world's biggest supplier of enriched uranium, accounting for nearly half of the global capacity. Moscow's state-owned nuclear power company, Rosatom, has earned billions from U.S. and European customers. Russia could disrupt these supplies to the United States tomorrow or at any time. Putin won't hesitate to weaponize Russia's energy supplies for his strategic advantage. As we know, that the uncertainties of war could disrupt this supply and lead to the loss of nuclear fuel supplies. And we know that the uncertainties of war could disrupt this supply and lead to the loss of nuclear fuel supplies. The harm from any of this would not be immediate. That is because the industry has long lead stockpiles of fuel supplies, and there are other government resources that have been established, which would protect operations for vulnerable reactors for many years. Also, fortunately, the Ukraine war is compelling European and U.S. utilities to shift contracts to non-Russian fuels. But this is not expected to be enough to build the domestic capacity to replace Russian fuels or to solve our fuel supply vulnerability, which will have long-term consequences for the health of the industry. People may not realize it, but fuel processing plants in the United States already have the licensed capacity today to replace the supply of Russian low-enriched uranium fuel. The problem is no facility owner is going to invest the billions of dollars to reach that licensed capacity without the certainty of long-term contracts for their products to cover the investments. And those long-term contracts from fuel customers, the utilities, will not be written if there remains uncertainty about the future of Russian fuels and the risk that Russia will once again be able to flood the market with its massive production capacity. Last week, Secretary Granholm agreed that we must make sure our fleet is secure and should ban Russian fuels as a part of a long-term uranium strategy. However, she had the sequence exactly backwards. To flip the switch on building American nuclear fuels infrastructure and provide the domestic fuels industry needs, we first need to signal that Russia won't be able to come into the American market for a very long time. H.R. 1042 provides the long-term certainty needed to establish a durable domestic supply of fuel for the fleet. It establishes a prohibition on Russian-sourced fuels and waivers to cover supply gaps leading up to a date certain, 2028, when no more Russian fuel will be allowed to be imported into the United States. This both protects any identified short-term needs of the industry and provides the long-term certainty necessary for contracts and investments to flow to build out American capacity. This puts the private market to work, a market involving tens of billions of dollars through 2040. This protects taxpayers who also need certainty that any DOE assistance will not be wasted with a rebound to Russian fuels. H.R. 1042 provides that there will be a role for federal support, but we first must have the market certainty in place to assess what that support should be. I'm pleased Mr. Latta has offered this amendment to update our bill to require a comprehensive market evaluation, something DOE has yet to do. This will provide the information necessary to target any additional assistance where it may be needed so we ensure a strong domestic fuel supply. HR 1042 will make our domestic industry more secure from the looming threats of Russia. I urge you to support the Prohibiting Russian Uranium Act. It strengthens American industry, protects taxpayers, increases our security, and will help stop Putin from weaponizing energy resources to undermine freedom here and around the world. It strengthens American industry, protects taxpayers. I think I just said that. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Generally yields back. Any other member seeking recognition? Mr. Cardenas.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief. I was trying to look for an opportunity to say what I'm about to say with germaneness, and since uranium has a half-life of thousands of years, I just wanted to say thank you to my wife, Norma, for 31 years of marriage today, and the germaneness.
Congratulations.
And the germaneness is that my love for you is eternal.
Gentleman yields back. Any other members seeking recognition? Congratulations, Tony. Any member seeking to offer an amendment? Mr. Pallon's recognized.
That's hard to follow, but thank you. Yes, I have an amendment that asks Mr.
Clerk will
Chairman.
report the amendment.
MN 01.
Amendment to HR 1042, offered by Mr. Pallone. Strike Section 3 and insert the following. Section 3, United States Nuclear Fuel Security Initiative. A, sense of Congress.
Further reading of the amendments dispensed with. Mr. Pallon's recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with Chair Rogers that our civilian nuclear fleet's dependence on Russian uranium is a problem, and we're certainly willing to work in a bipartisan fashion to address this issue. Unfortunately, as Energy Secretary Granholm highlighted in this very room last week when she came before the subcommittee, if we're serious about weaning ourselves off of Russian uranium, then we have to be serious about making investments in the domestic uranium supply chain. Now, setting a deadline, as Chair Rogers said, for ending imports will create a market signal for expanded private investment, but this will need to be paired, in my opinion, with federal support to quickly end the use of Russian fuel. Without government investment, a 2026 target will not be tenable. So right now, there's only a single uranium enrichment facility operating in the United States and can only support roughly 1/3 of our uranium requirements for our nuclear fleet. There are 0, not 1, uranium conversion facilities currently operating in the U.S. So simply put, right now, we lack the infrastructure to ban all Russian uranium imports overnight, and such a ban could put at risk our nation's largest single source of clean energy. Instead, we have to wind down imports of Russian uranium while simultaneously investing in our own domestic manufacturing and processing capabilities, which is exactly what my amendment does. My amendment simply adds a new section to the bill that is identical to a bill introduced by Mr. Latta, the Nuclear Fuel Security Act. This bill would create programs within the Department of Energy to ensure the supply of low-enriched uranium that our current reactors demand and the high, say, low-enriched uranium that the next generation advanced nuclear reactors will need. Partnering these ideas together will allow us to ensure we get off Russian uranium responsibly without handicapping our domestic nuclear industry. In fact, we understand that the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee will hold a markup tomorrow on similar language to this amendment, also pairing it with language to ban Russian imports. So I urge any members of this subcommittee interested in working in a thoughtful manner on this vital issue to support my amendment. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the amendment? Mr. Latta is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate my colleagues on the other side of the aisle for their engagement on this issue on nuclear fuels. I said earlier, I'm proud of the work that I have done and the other members of the subcommittee and for helping to spur this important conversation that we're having, especially this conversation that came up when the Secretary was here last week and with the conversation we're having today. With the market evaluation component in H.R. 1042 takes the right approach of reducing the United States' reliance on Russian imports of uranium. In light of the new feedback we've received and the good conversations I've had with my colleagues and with stakeholders, I am hopeful that we can incorporate the feedback into an updated version of my legislation. If my colleague would be willing to withdraw the amendment, I am committed to working with you, our full committee chair, and other members of this committee to update this legislation that can be considered within subcommittee in a very near future. And with that, I yield back.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, I yield back. Or yield to my friend.
I appreciate that, and I certainly would like to work with you. That's the whole point. But I do think that it's important to move forward with this amendment today. But again, it's essentially what you had stated in your bill, and I don't see any reason why we shouldn't pair it today. Again, I understand that this deadline for ending imports is a good thing to do, but I think that we need to have some federal support to end the use of Russian fuel. And without that government investment, I don't think the target that the chair has proposed can be met. So I don't see any reason why we shouldn't move forward with the amendment. So I'm not going to withdraw it, but I appreciate what you said.
Well, reclaiming my time, and I thank my friend, but as I said, I think that if we can work on this legislation in the future on both sides of the aisle, I'm committed to it. I want to make sure we get this across the finish line. But at this time, I would ask my fellow members to oppose the amendment, and at this time, yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Any other members seeking recognition on the amendment? Seeing none.
Ask for a roll call, Mr. Chairman. I mean, you were going to maybe do it anyway, but I would ask for it.
So no other members seeking recognition. A roll call has been requested on the amendment, so the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes no. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon votes no. Mr. Wahlberg. Mr. Wahlberg votes no. Mr. Palmer. Mr. Palmer votes no. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Curtis votes no. Ms. Lesko. Ms. Lesko votes no. Mr. Pence. Mr. Pence votes no. Mr. Armstrong. Mr. Armstrong votes no. Mr. Weber. Mr. Weber votes no. Mr. Balderson. Mr. Balderson votes no. Mr. Pfluger. Mr. Pfluger votes no. Chair Rogers. Chair Rogers votes no. Chair Duncan. Chair Duncan votes no. Ms. DeGette. Aye. Ms. DeGette votes aye. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters votes aye. Ms. Fletcher. Aye. Ms. Fletcher votes aye. Ms. Matsui. Aye. Ms. Matsui votes aye. Mr. Tonko.
Aye.
Mr. Tonko votes aye. Mr. Veazey. Mr. Veazey votes aye. Ms. Custer. Ms. Custer votes aye. Ms. Schreier. Ms. Schreier votes aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Mr. Cardenas. Mr. Cardenas votes aye. Ms. Blunt-Rochester. Ms. Blunt-Rochester votes aye. Mr. Pallone. Aye. Mr. Pallone votes aye.
Any member unrecorded? Clerk will report the total.
Chair Duncan, on that vote, there were 13 ayes and 17 noes.
The noes have it, and the amendment fails. Any further discussion on the bill? Mr. Palmer is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be very brief. In this discussion about where we're heading in regard to the use of our nuclear facilities for generating power, we had a very productive and instructive, in my opinion, hearing on next generation nuclear and where we ought to go. And one of the questions that I posed to the director of our nuclear laboratory in Idaho was about how we can recycle what we have always considered spent nuclear fuel in next generation nuclear. And I asked him if we utilized what is in storage in, I think, 36 states that we've accumulated over the years, how long could we operate our nuclear facilities using spent fuel? In other words, not relying on anybody else. And he had actually already run those numbers, and he said 100 years. So our long-term perspective really ought to be directed toward next-generation nuclear, and it helps alleviate any reliance on Russia or anybody else for our nuclear fuel. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I happily yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the bill? Mr. Curtis recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I speak from a very unique perspective. I think Mr. Pallone mentioned there's one active uranium processing mill in the United States, and I'm very proud that that's in my district. And what I've seen is, there's been a lot of discussion today about our ability to ramp up to the capacity that's needed. And what I've seen is an abundance of overregulation on this processing mill. What I've seen is signals from Washington, D.C. that investors would be scared of and shy away from. And if we really want to amp up U.S. production, I think we need to change two factors, and that's the message and signal that we're sending from Washington, D.C., that we're going to do business here in the United States, and that we'll regulate this mill with appropriateness for environmental and safety standards, but not with an environmental agenda which goes far beyond these. So I support this bill today, and you can imagine how it's viewed with hypocrisy in my district that we're willing to import this from Russia and then turn a blind eye to the way that it's processed over there, the environmental standards that are ignored, the human rights standards that are ignored, and then overregulate that in my district where we have an abundance of uranium and a processing mill. So I add my support to this bill, and I hope that we'll send the right messages so that we can do this at home in a reasonably responsible way, and I yield the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Any other member seeking recognition? Chair will seek recognition, and I move to strike last word and recognized. When I was a young man in the 1970s, the Department of Energy was created. And it was created for one purpose, to end our dependency on foreign countries for our energy. And energy today takes a lot of different forms. But the mission of the DOE is still clear, to make sure that this nation, from a national security aspect and just from a standard of living aspect, that we can meet our own energy needs in this country. Pick your source. Today we're talking about uranium and the fact that our nation gets and relies upon 20% or more of enriched uranium from a foreign adversary, Russia. In the spirit of how the DOE is created, this is something the Department of Energy should be focused on. It shouldn't take an act of Congress to say we need a domestic supply of enriched uranium to fuel the nuclear reactors that provide the baseload energy that our constituents require and depend on every day. We should not be reliant on another country to meet our needs. Shoring up domestic supply chain for enriched uranium that our utilities can use to produce the power is critical to this nation. We've seen what Vladimir Putin has done with influencing policy and standard of living issues in Europe by cutting on and cutting off the flow of natural gas and other energy sources to Europe. What's to say he doesn't cut off or limit the supply of enriched uranium to the United States? It's a national security issue for baseload generation. Even in the move to lessen carbon emissions in this country, nuclear power plays a huge role in that. But in order for it to continue to play a huge role and a future larger role in energy production in this country, we've got to make sure they have the fuel that's necessary to burn in the reactors. Bottom line. I agree with Mr. Palmer. We have to, and I commit to having a hearing on reprocessing and closing the fuel cycle and what we do with nuclear waste. And I look at it as an asset, not a waste. It's a national asset. It sits in 39 states, Mr. Palmer, not 36. 39 at 121 sites. And that is an asset that can be reprocessed and used, as you said, for over 100 years of fuel. But until we get to that point, we need to make sure that utilities have a steady, reliable domestically sourced supply chain of enriched uranium for our reactors. It's a national security issue, and the market needs this right signal that Congress is sending that we are focused on a domestic supply chain for that. I think Chair Rogers' bill is appropriate in saying there needs to be a drop-dead date, there needs to be a timeline, there needs to be a date certain so that the market can respond to that. It's a mature market, it can do this. We can do this, be a leader in this globe on nuclear technology and nuclear fuel and nuclear energy production. I believe that really is a bipartisan approach. I'm seeing more and more signals from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle that they are embracing nuclear, advanced nuclear, and SMRs and everything that we're looking at. But in order for any of those technologies to work, it has to have either low enriched or highly enriched nuclear fuel, domestically sourced, so we're not reliant on the whims of some oligarch or dictator across the globe. So this is the right bill. I commend Chair Rogers for putting this up, and I fully support it. And I like the Manchin bill and Latta's bill, and we'll deal with that. But today is the right time to pass this legislation to the full committee, get it to the floor, send it to the Senate, and do the right thing for sourcing, domestically sourcing, something that is so critical to our baseload generation across this country and the future of nuclear energy in this country. And so I urge my colleagues to support that. I'll yield back my time. Any further discussion on the bill? Seeing none, a roll call has been requested, so the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes aye. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes aye. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Buchan. Mr. Buchan votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg. Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Palmer. Mr. Palmer votes aye. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Curtis votes aye. Ms. Lesko. Ms. Lesko votes aye. Mr. Pence. Mr. Pence votes aye. Mr. Armstrong. Mr. Armstrong votes aye. Mr. Weber. Mr. Weber votes aye. Mr. Balderson. Mr. Balderson votes aye. Mr. Pfluger. Mr. Pfluger votes aye. Chair Rogers. Chair Rogers votes aye. Chair Duncan. Chair Duncan votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters votes no. Ms. Fletcher. No. Ms. Fletcher votes no. Ms. Matsui.
No.
Ms. Matsui votes no. Mr. Tonko.
No.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Mr. Veazey. Mr. Veazey votes no. Ms. Custer. Ms. Custer votes no. Ms. Schreier. Ms. Schreier votes aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Mr. Cardenas. Mr. Cardenas votes no. Ms. Blunt-Rochester. Ms. Blunt-Rochester votes no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no.
Are the members unrecorded? Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally.
Chair Duncan, on that vote, there were 18 ayes and 12 noes.
The ayes have it. The bill is agreed to and will be forwarded to the full committee. Without objection, the staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to legislation approved by the subcommittee today. So ordered. Without objection, subcommittee will stand adjourned.